Moana. By the end of the weekend, I was dying to get back to work. Since we decided not to leave the penthouse after all, I decided that it wouldn't hurt any to return to teaching. Besides, Ella needed to go back to school as well. And since she didn't remember the events of the night that we were kidnapped, she was only getting more aggravated by the day. With each passing day, Ella was becoming more confused and agitated, and I was feeling more stir-crazy, which only led to increased flashbacks from the whole ordeal. So on Monday morning, I got dressed for work. "Where are you going?" Edric asked, looking up from his newspaper as I walked through the living room. "I need to get back to work," I said. "I can't just use a substitute forever. Tomorrow, maybe Ella should go back to school as well." Edric's icy gray eyes widened. He threw his newspaper down and stood abruptly, shaking his head. "You can't go. It's dangerous." "Edric, I'll be in a school just a few blocks away in the middle of the afternoon," I said. "There's a security guard on the campus who watches everything. I'll tell them about the situation so they can keep an eye out for any trouble." For a few moments, the alpha billionaire stared wildly at me as he gritted his teeth. I held my head high to show that I wasn't going to back down. Despite what had happened almost 2 weeks prior, I wasn't a damsel in distress, and I had a job to do. Finally, Edric seemed to see that I wasn't backing down, and he let out a sigh, passing his hand over his face. "Take one of the bodyguards with you, then," he said quietly. "Take Darren. He'll protect you. Actually, I'll drive with you as well." Before I could say anything, Edric rushed over to the foyer and began to slip his shoes on. I watched as he pulled 2 surgical masks out of his pocket, then held one out to me along with my wide-brimmed sun hat. "Here. To protect your identity during the walk, we'll go out the back, and if you tuck in your hair, you'll be less likely to be noticed." "Edric," I said exasperatedly, "hold on. I'll walk with you and wear the disguise, but I can't bring a bodyguard to school. Darren is big and looks threatening. He'll scare the children, and I don't even think that the headmistress will allow it anyway. And also, I want to walk, not drive. I feel cooped up." Edric stared at me for another few moments. I could tell right off the bat that he wouldn't give up on the bodyguard, nor was he likely to give up on most of his stipulations. I figured that it was worth a try, though. Finally, after a long time of staring silently at each other, Edric seemed to relent a little bit. "I know that you feel safer with Ethan and Kelly in jail, but it's still dangerous for you out there," he said firmly. "But how about this? Can you just let one of the bodyguards drive you? They can just wait in the car and keep an eye on the school entrance while you're at work. If you'll just allow that, I promise I won't nag you about it any longer." I chewed my lip for a moment, thinking. Edric was right. It was still dangerous, and even if no one knew that I was the golden wolf yet, and I wasn't yet at risk of being hunted, the paparazzi were on another frenzy because of the news footage of what happened at the warehouse. Finally, I nodded and sighed. "Okay," I said. "I'll let one of the bodyguards drive me." "Thank you." Edric let out a small sigh of relief, then walked up to me and kissed my forehead. I felt myself blush a bit. He had been a lot more physically affectionate ever since I marked him, and I had to admit that I was enjoying it quite a lot. "And Ella can go back to school too?" I asked, looking up at him. Edric nodded, although a bit hesitantly. "I'll talk to her about it today," he replied. Secretly, although I wasn't going to pressure him, I hoped that he would also talk to her about what really happened and what her mother was really like. I doubted that he would do it so soon, though. Part of me thought that he should set up counseling for her ahead of time, as that news would no doubt come as a major shock to her. She might even resent him for lying to her. Ella was a smart girl, not just an airheaded little kid who couldn't comprehend such complicated topics. She deserved the truth, but the truth would come with unforeseen consequences. As I thought about this, flashes of seeing Ella's little sleeping body tied up to the chair in the warehouse suddenly and unexpectedly flashed through my mind, followed by images of Ethan holding the gun up to my face. I felt a pang in my chest, as though something was weighing me down and restricting my breathing. For the briefest of moments, I felt as though I was back there again, back in the warehouse with the bright white spotlight beaming onto me. "Moana?" Edric's voice pulled me out of my daze. "Moana, are you okay?" When I came back to reality, I quickly blinked the tears out of my eyes and nodded, forcing a smile. Edric was looking down at me with concern drawn across his face. "Sorry," I said, hoping that he hadn't seen my tears. "Thank you for being so understanding." Edric looked at me for a moment with a worried look in his eyes. I thought for sure that he had picked up on my flashback and that he would tell me not to go, but surprisingly, he didn't say anything. He just nodded and stepped onto the elevator with me, then took me downstairs to get into the car. He saw me off with another kiss on my forehead, and then I watched his face fade into the distance as the bodyguard drove off. Those flashbacks had been happening more and more frequently with each passing day. It was strange, but they almost seemed to get more vivid as time went on, as though the horrific experience of what happened in that warehouse was blocked out of my mind at first, but was now returning. I thought that it was just from being cooped up in the penthouse. It had to be. Surely I would feel better after another few days at work. But somehow, no matter how much I told myself that things would get better, there was a part of me that wasn't so sure. And as the bodyguard drove me to work, I began to wonder if I would have a flashback while I was teaching. I knew that I would be able to handle a simple flashback if one were to happen at work, but lately I had been feeling a sense of losing control during some of the worst flashbacks. I hoped that it wouldn't trigger me to shift involuntarily. Moana. The bodyguard dropped me off in front of the school, and I got out of the car. Already, as I walked up the pathway to the entrance of the school, I could see that some of the older students and even other teachers were giving me strange looks. I didn't think too much of it, however, as I had just gotten out of an unmarked vehicle with tinted windows and an intimidating-looking man in the driver's seat. I would have stared at me, too. But as I headed inside, the staring continued. Even people who hadn't seen me get out of the car were giving me odd looks. I felt as though people were whispering about me, but once again, I decided not to let it get to me and headed to my classroom. Once I got to my classroom, I decided to head to the faculty lounge to make myself a cup of coffee and warm up a scone, just as I always did when I first got to school. When I entered the faculty lounge, a couple of other teachers were sitting at the table and chatting. As soon as I walked in, though, their conversation stopped abruptly. "Good morning," I said with a warm smile as I walked over to the coffee machine, trying not to show how uncomfortable I felt. "How was everyone's weekend?" One of the teachers, who was a high school math teacher that I had only ever exchanged pleasantries with before, sort of scoffed. Something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck raise, and I turned to face her. "Is something wrong?" I asked, feeling anger beginning to bubble up inside of me as I was instantly reminded of what it felt like when those wealthy werewolf women were nasty to me at the networking event that I went to with Edric. "Oh, nothing, nothing," the teacher said, waving her hand dismissively and throwing me a stiff smile. I stared at them for a few moments longer. Finally, the male teacher who was sitting with her spoke up when he realized that I knew that something was going on. "Sorry, Moana," he said, sounding more polite than the other teacher. "It's just, well, we heard about what happened at the warehouse. It's all over the news, and, I asked, folding my arms across my chest. The teacher's face went red. "There are some rumors circulating that you're not actually human, but a late bloomer?" I finished for him. Behind me, the coffee machine began to spurt my coffee out into my cup. Other than that, the air in the room was thick and silent. The teacher slowly nodded as his face turned into an even deeper shade of red. "Not that it's a bad thing, necessarily," he continued. "It's just that, well, late bloomers are very rare. Some people see it as a sign of bad luck, and with your baby on the way, people like to gossip. Before, I was angry enough that they were talking about me, but now, to hear that they were talking about my baby. What about my baby?" I snarled, my voice spiking in a similar staccato to the coffee machine as it beeped behind me. The male teacher fell silent. His mouth opened and closed a few times as he tried to come up with what to say, making him look like a fish gasping on land. Suddenly, the female teacher spoke up. "More often than not, the children of late bloomers come out with all sorts of developmental problems," she said. The female teacher was far nastier with her words and didn't beat around the bush. When she finished speaking, she just looked at me with a bit of a smirk on her face. Now, I was beginning to feel the anger bubbling up even more. I whirled around and picked my coffee up, not caring that I sloshed it on the counter in my haste, then turned and stormed off toward the door. Just before I left, though, I turned back one last time and shot the two teachers an angry glare. "I don't care if you gossip about me, but don't you dare gossip about my baby," I growled. There was a lot more I wanted to say, but I chose not to. And with that, I left the two teachers alone with their mouths hanging open and stormed out without even taking my scone with me. "Good job," I said, clapping my hands together as I watched one of the children in my kindergarten class cut a perfectly straight line with her safety scissors. The little girl beamed up at me with rosy red cheeks and shot me a toothless grin. I moved on to the next student and repeated the same drill. "Here you go," I said, crouching down to the little boy's level. "Like this." I showed him how to use the scissors, and then held his hand while he cut. As he cut, he stuck his tongue out in intense concentration. Miss Moana?" one of the children suddenly said. "Just a moment, Jeremy," I replied. "I'm helping Bobby." The little boy who just called my name fell silent, but only for a moment. Miss Moana, it's important," he nagged. I let out a sigh. "Jeremy, if you need to use the potty, you can go by yourself," I said while the little boy that I was helping struggled to cut around a circular shape on his paper. Once again, the little boy, Jeremy, fell silent for just a couple of moments before calling out again. "Miss Moana, there's a man looking in the window with bin." "It's binoculars, Jeremy," one of the little girls corrected with a snide tone of voice. As they spoke, however, I already had jerked my head up and pulled the scissors out of Bobby's chubby little hands before running over to the window. "Shit," I whispered under my breath, then clamped my hand over my mouth in the hopes that none of the children heard me curse. Just as the children had said, someone was watching us through the window with binoculars. It was the bodyguard. He was sitting on the hood of the car, looking right in through our windows. When one of the children waved, he even waved back. "What's he doing, Miss Moana?" one of the children asked innocently. I shook my head and instantly closed the blinds, feeling as though my privacy and the privacy of the children had been completely violated. Edric had said that the bodyguard would wait in the car, not sit outside and watch us with binoculars like he was at the opera. "Who wants to play Duck, Duck, Goose?" I asked, clapping my hands together to divert the kids' attention, which worked. I had the children sit around in a circle on the carpet, and for the remainder of class, they played Duck, Duck, Goose. However, I couldn't stop feeling violated by the bodyguard's actions. I decided that, later that day, I would have to give the bodyguard a piece of my mind. And later, I would have to give Edric a piece of my mind as well, Moana. A little while after I caught the bodyguard that Edric sent with me, watching me through the window with binoculars, I calmed down a bit and didn't feel quite as mad about it. I decided against talking to Edric about it later, and figured that I should just give it some time before I started any arguments. After all, Edric was just trying to keep me safe by sending the bodyguard with me. The fact alone that he was even okay with me returning to work and with Ella returning to school was already a miracle. I didn't want to accidentally rock the boat and make Edric change his mind, because I knew that the alpha billionaire would be too stubborn if he suddenly decided that it was a bad idea for either of us to return to our normal lives. However, on my lunch break, I started to notice that something was off when one of the other teachers came in and knocked on my door with a somewhat angry expression on her face. "Hi," I said, setting down my sandwich with surprise, seeing as how no one ever came to my classroom during my break. "Can I help you with anything?" The teacher, a young woman about my age, who was one of the kindergarten teachers, stood in my doorway and folded her arms across her chest. Like me, she also had long red hair. "Some man has been staring through my window, and I know it has something to do with you," she growled. "One of my kids said that he was staring through your window earlier, and she's very upset about it." I felt my face go pale and my blood run cold. "I'm so sorry," I replied nervously, standing and wringing my hands. "He's not bad or anything of the sort. It's just that—" "I don't care what your excuse is," the teacher interrupted. her voice sharp and grating. "You either need to take care of it or I'm going to tell the headmistress. It's already bad enough that we have to deal with your bad luck, and now you're bringing strange, intimidating men on school property. What the hell is wrong with you?" As the teacher spoke, I felt as though my body had officially drained itself of all blood, leaving me standing there as nothing but a cold, empty husk of the woman who I once was. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could stammer anything out, she whirled around and stormed off. I felt sick. The bodyguard must have mistaken her for me. He probably saw her red hair through the window and was watching her, not realizing that he was watching entirely the wrong person. She was right, though. Despite the fact that she felt the need to get a little dig-in about my supposed bad luck as a late bloomer, he needed to be taken care of. He was making children and teachers alike uncomfortable. Grumbling to myself under my breath, I stormed out of my classroom with my fists clenched and ran down the hallway. I ran past teachers, students, and classrooms, past the confused elderly security guard, and stormed out of the building and into the sunshine. Just as I suspected, the bodyguard was leaning against the side of his car with a pair of binoculars in his hand. As I stormed up to him, I saw him push a button on his headset and say something before he straightened himself and put the binoculars behind his back. "Afternoon, miss," he said politely, his sharp jawline jutting out as he towered over me. "Is everything all right?" "All right?" I asked. "All right? You're practically terrorizing the students and the teachers at this school." The security guard furrowed his brow and looked down at me through his dark sunglasses. I'm not sure what you're referring to, miss," he said. "I'm just doing my job." Suddenly, I lurched forward and reached around his back. I grabbed the binoculars that were in his hand and yanked them away before he had a chance to stop me, then waved them in his face. "Binoculars?" I growled. "For goodness' sake, this is ridiculous. Your job was to drive me here, keep an eye on the property in case anyone suspicious shows up, and drive me home. That's it. And now you're acting like the suspicious one, looking through windows with bloody binoculars." After I finished speaking, the air fell silent. Through his dark sunglasses, I could see that his eyes were wide. My own eyes were wide, too, because without realizing it, I had raised my voice and was now shouting at him. Even passers-by were giving us odd looks, and some of the children on the playground were standing by the fence and staring at us with open mouths, while the recess attendants were trying and failing to usher them away. "Miss, I'm just doing what Mr. Morgan." "You're my employee, too," I said, lowering my voice so as not to be heard. "And I'm telling you to tone it back, or I'll call the police and have you escorted off of the school's property." The security guard looked at me for a moment in a state of shock before he finally nodded and hung his head slightly. "Yes, ma'am," he said, sounding rather much like one of the children who I had to scold for being unruly in the classroom. "I'll tone it back." "Thank you," I muttered. I watched with my arms folded across my chest as he circled around the car and got into the driver's seat. Then, whirling around, I stormed past the playground, ignoring the shocked students and recess attendants, and ran back inside. I walked past the still confused security guard, past the classrooms and students and teachers, and back into my classroom. Once I was inside, I closed the door behind me as calmly as I could. And once I was concealed inside of my classroom, I angrily chucked the binoculars as hard as I could into the trash can by my desk. I relished in the sound of the plastic and glass breaking for a moment before I dusted my hands off and sat back down to finish my sandwich. Thankfully, the bodyguard wasn't an issue for the remainder of the day. However, it seemed as though everyone saw my little display earlier, and by the end of the day I felt as though even more people were staring at me and whispering as I locked up my classroom and headed out. I kept my head down, ignoring the nasty whispers from fellow teachers as I passed by their classrooms. But when I passed by the headmistress's office, I felt my face flush red as I saw her annoyed expression looking up at me from behind her desk through the open door. Swallowing, I bowed my head and scurried past. Hopefully, I thought to myself as I rushed out and down the pathway, then climbed into the back of the car, tomorrow would be better. And if not, Edric was going to have to settle for an alternative to the bodyguard. Edric. The thought of sending Moana back to work and Ella back to school made me incredibly nervous, but I knew that it needed to be done. It wasn't fair to keep them both cooped up, and as long as they both had the proper protection, I decided that it would be all right if it would make my girls happy. On the first day, Moana went to work by herself while I talked to Ella. Ella was becoming increasingly aggravated lately, seeing as how she didn't remember anything from the night of the kidnapping. Eventually, however, she was bound to find out. Surely, her little friends at school had heard whisperings of what happened at the warehouse already, and although the details of what really happened weren't known by the public yet, I didn't want Ella to learn about it from anyone except for me. So, while Moana was at work, I sat Ella down to talk to her. She was holding one of her dolls tightly in her hand and brushing its hair furiously, as though she was taking a bit of her frustration out on it. "Princess, I need to talk to you," I said gently. "Can you please put your doll down?" With a huff, Ella threw her doll down on the floor where we sat and folded her arms across her chest. I debated scolding her for that, but decided against it. "Why can Moana go back to school, but I can't?" she growled, her little pointed ears and sharp fangs showing as she shifted slightly from her anger. "It's not fair." "I know, Princess," I replied. "You'll go back to school tomorrow, but I need to talk to you first about why all of this has been happening lately." Ella seemed intrigued by what I said, and her fangs withdrew slightly at the prospect of going back to school. She waited patiently and allowed me to talk. "The other night, when you woke up in the police car, I wasn't entirely truthful with you," I said. "I told you that there was nothing to worry about, which was the truth. But what I didn't tell you was that." As I slowly and gently told Ella the entire story of what happened, her little eyes widened and her face went pale. When I was finished, she looked up at me incredulously. "Uncle Ethan really did that?" she whispered. I nodded. "I'm sorry, Princess," I said gently. "I hope you're not mad at me for not telling you sooner." Ella looked up at me for a few moments longer before she quietly climbed into my lap. I held her there for a long time, gently rocking her back and forth. Now that the story was out, both of us felt much better. But there was something that I still didn't tell her. I didn't tell her about her mom. Later that afternoon, I was working in my study when my phone began to ring. When I picked it up, it was the bodyguard. My blood ran cold as I heard his voice, expecting something bad to have happened to Moana. I wondered if she shifted at work or if my father showed up. All of the worst outcomes immediately came to mind before I even heard what really happened. "Yes," I said, standing abruptly from my desk and immediately preparing to run down there myself. "Is everything all right? Is she hurt?" "She's fine," the bodyguard Darren said. "Nothing happened. Don't worry." "Oh." I let out a sigh of relief and sat down as I ran a hand through my hair. "What is it then?" On the other side of the phone, I heard Darren let out an audible sigh. "She saw me watching," he replied. "I guess other teachers complained too. She came out here and made quite the scene, and she took my binoculars." As the bodyguard spoke, I felt myself sink in my chair. Of course, Moana had made a scene. Honestly, it was stupid of me to think that she wouldn't. I wasn't surprised that other teachers were complaining either. Maybe I was a bit too aggressive with my orders when I secretly told Darren to watch her through the window and not let her out of his sight. "All right," I said, sighing again as I leaned back in my chair and shut my eyes exasperatedly. "Tomorrow, just drop her off and act as though you're coming home, but watch undercover," I said. "I don't care how you do it, so long as you don't let Moana or Ella see you, and you don't alarm any of the teachers or students. Got it?" "Yes, sir," Darren replied. After that, I hung up. That evening, I half expected Moana to give me a talking to over what had happened, but surprisingly, she didn't say a word. The next morning, she simply woke up and got Ella ready for school. I saw both of them off at the lobby door downstairs, then watched as they drove away before I headed back up to the penthouse. However, by that afternoon, I had received yet another call from the bodyguard. This time, Moana had caught him watching from a park bench across the street, gave him the middle finger through her classroom window, and then held up a sign that said that she was going to call the police. It took her holding up her phone in the window and dialing the numbers for him to finally walk away and call me again. Even though Moana's fiery attitude made me want to laugh, I knew that this was serious. Clearly, this bodyguard wasn't meshing well with her. She obviously didn't feel comfortable or trust him, so after dismissing him from the job, I decided that it was time to take a different approach. Moana and Ella needed to be allowed to go to work and school. However, it was still dangerous. Besides, if she suddenly began to shift in her classroom, having a bodyguard sitting outside wouldn't be much help. She needed someone specialized, someone who she was comfortable with having close by. Maybe she needed someone who she saw as more of a friend than an intimidating bodyguard. If I could just find someone who could get comfortable with Moana enough to stay inside the classroom with her, someone who could be easily passed as a teacher's aide so that the other teachers wouldn't be too suspicious, it would be perfect. I would feel better knowing that she had someone right by her side in case something happened, and maybe she would be less resentful if she felt less intimidated by this new bodyguard. But who could I give this task to? All of the bodyguards that I hired were large, intimidating men with combat training who I had initially hired with the intention of patrolling the mountain estate. They were extremely talented and valuable, and I felt safe having them on my security team. But I needed someone who Moana could relate to, and someone who also had specialized experience with being a personal bodyguard for a young woman. Suddenly, I had an idea. With a sigh, I picked up my phone to call my chief security officer, Edric. With an exasperated sigh, I picked up my phone to call my chief security officer. "Afternoon, Mr. Morgan," he said when he answered. "Everything all right?" "Yes," I replied. "But I need a favor. Do you have any female bodyguards you could send over for an interview?" The chief security officer paused for a moment, thinking. "I do," he replied. "I can send them over tomorrow. Is there anything you need them for specifically?" I sighed again, thinking back on the incident with Moana and the male bodyguard that I had assigned to her. She clearly felt uncomfortable with him, and it was obvious that the other teachers and students were uncomfortable as well. All I wanted was for Moana to be protected, but it wasn't going to help any if she kept pushing away the bodyguards. "I need someone who can work closely with my fiancé," I replied, still feeling strange about referring to Moana as that. Even though we had marked each other and had become a lot more affectionate since it had happened, we were still technically not in any sort of official relationship. At least, we hadn't talked about it yet. "She needs someone who can be helpful with kids, and someone who's easy to get along with, but who will also provide good protection. Do you have anyone like that?" For a few more moments, the security officer paused. I could hear him typing on a keyboard on the other end, like he was looking something up. After a little while longer, he finally said, "Aha! I found someone." "Who is it?" I asked. "Her name is Catherine," he replied. "She's 28, has experience working on one-on-one jobs in family settings, and it looks like she performed excellently on all of her physical and intellectual exams." I nodded, letting out a small sigh of relief. "Send her over to the penthouse tomorrow," I replied. "I'd like to have an interview with her." I felt infinitely relieved by the time I hung up with the security officer. Perhaps having a female bodyguard who was good with kids might lift Moana's mood and make her feel a bit more comfortable. Not only that, but maybe I could finally rest easy during the day, knowing that Moana had an experienced bodyguard by her side in case of an emergency. Although part of me felt as though I would never really rest easy. Not as long as I still had to worry that Moana could shift at any point out of nowhere. For the rest of that day, I prepared what I would say to Moana. She hadn't exactly been out of line with how she handled her first bodyguard, per se, but I needed her to understand why it was so important for her to be more open to this new bodyguard. When she came home that afternoon, however, judging from the angry expression on her face and the way that she stormed toward me, it seemed as though my pre-planned speech might fall on deaf ears. As Moana stormed into the apartment, she immediately sent Ella off to her room to play, before grabbing me by the arm and pulling me unceremoniously into my study. When the door was shut behind us, she folded her arms across her chest and shot me an angry glare. "He can't keep stalking me like this," she growled. "The agreement was that he would drive me to work and wait in the car, not that he would sneak around with binoculars and spy on my every move. Yesterday, he mistook another red-haired teacher for me. Today, one of my students started crying because she was scared of the enormous man on the park bench who kept staring into the classroom window. Do you want me to lose my job?" I sighed and shook my head. "No, Moana," I replied. "Look, I'm sorry, but you need a bodyguard. I don't feel comfortable with you and Ella returning to school with someone just sitting outside. Someone could sneak in. You could shift during class and wreak havoc if no one is equipped to handle it." "I won't shift," she insisted. "I think that I would know if I was going to shift." "It's not that simple," I replied exasperatedly. "When someone shifts for the first time, they can't always recognize the warning signs. Many people can lose consciousness during their first time shifting, and their wolf can cause a lot of damage. Normally, people shift for the first time as children in a safe environment with teachers. But as a late bloomer such as yourself, things are different. I understand that you're entitled to your independence, but do you want to potentially destroy your classroom and terrify your students if you shift suddenly? What if you injured someone?" Moana fell silent for a few moments while she chewed the inside of her cheek. "Fine," she finally said quietly. "I get it. I get that I'm just a late bloomer who could cause all sorts of problems." I raised my eyebrows, shocked at this sudden use of words. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "Where did that come from?" "Everyone keeps saying that I'm bad luck as a late bloomer," Moana said, her voice quiet and almost timid. "My colleagues keep whispering about me. No one wants to be near me, and with this whole security guard nonsense, it's even worse. I'm not only there for a job, I was hoping that maybe, just maybe, I don't know. I thought that I could." "Make some friends?" I asked. Moana nodded, and I sighed, running my hand through my hair. "Would you want to be friends with superstitious people who spread nasty rumors like that anyway?" For a long time, Moana stared blankly at the floor in front of her. Her jaw shifted from side to side as she seemed to be thinking deeply, before she finally dropped her arms to her sides and shrugged. "I guess not," she said. "But either way, this bodyguard business is causing problems, and I do have a job to do. Besides, people know that Ella is my daughter, and I don't want anything bad to rub off on her." "Well," I smiled slightly, "you'll be happy to know that I found an alternative, a new bodyguard that you can have in the classroom with you. Wouldn't that be better?" I expected Moana to feel better, but for some reason, this only seemed to make her even angrier. Her cheeks turned a shade of red that almost matched her hair, and she folded her arms across her chest again and shook her head vigorously. "Did you not just listen to what I said?" she asked. "I won't allow a bodyguard in my classroom, and if you try, I'll send them away again." "No." Now I finally felt the need to put my foot down, and I narrowed my eyes at Moana. "No," I said, "you won't send them away. You're going to just have to deal with this new reality, Moana, or I'm going to have to take us to the mountain estate for real this time." Moana. The first day that my colleagues and students got wind of the bodyguard situation was already bad enough. By the second day, people were really beginning to pick up on the fact that a strange, intimidating man was sitting outside of the school and watching me with binoculars. Combined with the fact that everyone seemed to think that I was bad luck as a late bloomer, I quickly became even more of an outcast amongst the other teachers and even some of the older students. What I was most worried about, though, was that this would somehow reflect on Ella. I could handle people looking negatively upon me, but if they began to look negatively upon Ella because of me, then I couldn't live with it. When I went home on the second day, I decided that I had had enough. Yes, some horrible things had happened, but this whole bodyguard situation wasn't working out, and I couldn't risk it ruining both mine and Ella's reputations in an environment where our reputations were already fairly shaky because of my status as a late bloomer. At first, Edric seemed to be understanding. I thought that he would recommend a different approach. Maybe he could talk to the headmistress about hiring a second security guard for the school, or even put up cameras in my classroom just in case anything happened. But when he brought up the danger of me shifting in my classroom, He seemed to make a good point. It was a dangerous potential, and I didn't want anyone to get hurt. However, when he told me that I would have no choice but to allow a bodyguard into my classroom with me every day for the foreseeable future, I felt angry. "No," he said, "you won't send them away. You're going to just have to deal with this new reality, Moana, or I'm going to have to take us to the mountain estate for real this time." I felt my eyes widen. "You can't keep holding that over my head," I insisted. "We stayed here because both of us agreed that we didn't want to leave our home. You can't just threaten to rip us away again because I rightfully don't feel comfortable with having a bodyguard inside my classroom." Edric glared at me for a moment. "You need to be kept safe, Moana," he urged. "You and Ella. I don't want you getting hurt." "I can protect myself," I said. "I'm fine with finding an alternative method, and I understand why you're worried about me, but I don't need a bodyguard up my ass at all times. If something happens, I can handle my "Oh, can you?" Edric growled. "Just like how you almost got yourself and my daughter killed just a couple of weeks ago?" What about your supposed ability to protect yourself, then?" When Edric finished speaking, the air between us felt thick and heavy. I felt tears beginning to well up in my eyes, and Edric showed no signs of remorse for his harsh words. Nothing else was said between either of us before I whirled around and stormed out. I ran to my room and slammed the door behind me, not caring if it rattled the doorframe, then threw myself down on my bed and sobbed into my pillow. Of course I knew that I fucked up by putting Ella and myself in danger. I saw that night over and over again in my head. I saw flashes of Ella tied to the chair, of Ethan holding the gun to my head. I would never forget that night, and I was well aware that I had made a major mistake. But did Edric need to be so cruel about it? Did he really need to make such a low blow during an argument and remind me of my fatal failure? As I sobbed into my pillow, the images of that night flashed faster and faster through my mind until I felt sick and dizzy. I sobbed even harder, gripping my sheets so tightly in my hand that my knuckles hurt, just wishing that I could go back and undo everything that had happened that night. If I had just trusted Edric, if I had just not listened to Olivia and told him instead when she began talking to me. Suddenly, I felt a familiar little hand on the back of my head. I quickly jerked my head up, drying my eyes and sniffling loudly as I forced a smile. "Hey, love," I whispered, looking up at Ella. She was sitting on the side of my bed with a concerned look on her face as she gently stroked my long hair. At that moment, she looked so mature. Her eyes looked so empathetic and comforting, like a little adult, and she didn't say a word either. She just continued to sit there, gently stroking my hair with one hand while her other hand curled up between my fingers. The two of us laid there for a long time, Ella stroking my hair while I laid on my back and watched her. My tears slowly began to dry, and soon everything else fell away. I knew it all along, but I really knew how much I loved her just then. The way that her sweet face looked at me wiped away the horrible image that I had of her sleeping, tied up in the chair beside me in that dark and terrifying warehouse. I knew that Edric had told her about it, too. He had mentioned it the day before, that he had told her, but she hadn't said a word about it yet. What went through her little head when he told her, I wondered? Was she scared? Angry? Hurt? She didn't show any of those emotions now. She just seemed calm and empathetic, like a little cherub. "Are you okay, love?" I whispered, reaching up to brush some of her messy blonde hair out of her eyes. "Do you want to talk about what happened?" Ella simply shrugged. She seemed mostly unfazed by it, maybe because she didn't actually remember that night, but had just been told about it instead. Surely Edric kept out most of the grisly details of the night. Maybe, when she was older, she would want to know the full truth. But for now, she seemed content. Although part of me wondered why she hadn't asked about her real mom yet. Did Edric tell her, or was he still waiting? Suddenly, Ella popped up and jumped off of the bed. "I'll be right back," she said matter-of-factly, before running out of the room. I sat up and wiped my eyes, watching as she disappeared through the door. A few minutes passed, and I heard nothing. I began to think that she just got distracted from whatever it was that she was going to do, as children often did. And with a slight chuckle, I shook my head and swung my legs over the bed to get up and shut the door the rest of the way. But then, before I could get up, she suddenly returned holding Edric's hand. With a mischievous grin, she pushed him into the room and shut the door firmly behind him. Edric and I just stared at each other in surprise, blinking slowly in the waning light of my bedroom. Edric. Moana really could be far too stubborn for her own good sometimes. At first, I thought that we were coming to an understanding. She seemed to be on the same page as me when we discussed the dangers of not having security to keep an eye on her. When I told her that she would need to have a bodyguard in her classroom in case anything happened, however, her reaction was full of unnecessary anger. Of course, I expected her to be upset, but I thought that she at least understood the reasons behind why it was so important. There was a possibility that she could shift unexpectedly while she was teaching and cause mayhem. There was also a possibility that if my father or anyone else who wanted the golden wolf dead found out that she was the golden wolf, someone could come and try to hurt her. Nowhere was safe, and it didn't matter if she was teaching in the middle of the day in broad daylight. If someone wanted her dead, it would be too easy to get the job done unless she had someone by her side to keep her safe. Why couldn't she just understand that? Maybe I was a little too harsh when I told her that I would take her away to the mountain estate, but it was the first thing that came to my mind, and it was the truth. If she couldn't comply and at least attempt to have some sort of sense of self-preservation here, then we would need to leave the city after all. She had two choices. Live with the fact that she would need a bodyguard in her classroom for the foreseeable future, and stay in the city where she could keep her job and Ella could continue to go to school, or refuse to have a bodyguard in her classroom and go to live with me at the mountain estate. There was no in-between. When I told her that she had no choice, however, Moana got even more angry. Her face got red and she clenched her fists at her sides angrily, glaring at me with her green eyes. If something happens, I can handle myself. Oh, can you? I growled. Just like how you almost got yourself and my daughter killed just a couple of weeks ago? What about your supposed ability to protect yourself, then? Both of us fell silent. Moana stared at me for several seconds in disbelief. Admittedly, I did feel a little bad for my choice of wording, but I was telling the truth. I was forgiving of Moana, and I knew that she had been skillfully manipulated into trying to run away, but I was still wary about her decisions. I needed to keep my daughter, my mate, and my unborn child safe. Moana opened her mouth to say something, closed it again, and suddenly stormed out. A few moments later, I heard her bedroom door slam shut. I cursed under my breath and whirled around to walk over to my desk, where I angrily plopped myself down into my chair and let out an audible groan while I buried my face in my hands. Why did she need to be so stubborn? Why was it that these sorts of things always devolved into an argument, even when I was just trying to help her? Was it me? Was I the problem? Sighing, I sank further down into my chair and rubbed my eyes exhaustedly. Was I too harsh? I asked my wolf. Maybe a little, he responded. It wasn't her fault that she got manipulated. You know how Olivia is. I sighed again. I know that, I replied, not caring if I spoke out loud. It's just that... Suddenly I heard my door creak open. I looked up from my hands to see Ella standing in the doorway with a pout and with her arms folded across her chest. Hey, princess, I said gently. Is everything okay? Ella stared at me for a moment. She was still in her school uniform, we hadn't even had dinner yet, and Moana was already furious with me. No doubt that Ella heard our argument too. You made Moana cry, Ella growled. My eyes widened slightly. I did? I asked. I didn't mean to make her cry. I was just telling her the truth. But before I could say that, Ella suddenly stormed up to me and grabbed me by the sleeve with a fiery look in her eyes. She yanked on me angrily and took a step back while still holding my sleeve in her little hand. Come on, she said, her voice firm for such a little girl, almost as though she was a small adult. You need to apologize. I need to apologize? I asked with a chuckle. Maybe Moana needed to apologize first, I thought to myself. She was the one who got so angry with me that she stormed in here as soon as she got home from work and dragged me into my study to fight with me. Daddy! Ella shouted, stamping her foot on the floor angrily. Apologize to Moana now for making her cry. She's my mom now, and I don't like it when you make her sad." As Ella spoke, my eyes went even wider. Ella had referred to Moana as her mom. I hadn't heard her mention that before, although now that I thought of it, Moana had just mentioned that Ella told everyone that Moana was her mom at school. The thought of it created a sudden warmth in my chest, and I couldn't help but smile a bit. Suddenly, during my moment of weakness, Ella dragged me to my feet. As she dragged me out of my study and toward Moana's room, I didn't resist. She then dragged me over to Moana's room, unceremoniously shoved me inside, and slammed the door behind me. Moana was sitting up on the bed. We stared at each other for a few moments in shocked silence, and during those moments I realized that Ella was right. Moana had been crying. Her eyes looked red and puffy, and her cheeks had a slight sheen to them from the tears. She seemed to be trying to hide it, but I could tell right away. And the instant I saw that she had been crying, I realized that I had been far too harsh on her earlier. I shouldn't have said those things. I didn't mean any of them. I never wanted to make Moana cry. "I'm sorry," I whispered, taking a tentative step forward. "I didn't mean it." Moana said nothing. She just looked up at me with those reddened eyes with their emerald green irises. Her lower lip was quivering slightly, and she bit it to make it stop. Now more than ever, I wanted to hold her and kiss her all over. I took another tentative step forward, taking in the way that her red hair was messed up from crying into her pillow, and felt an ache in my chest as I realized just how much of a jerk I had been. Still, Moana said nothing. But then, without a word, she just held her arms out for me. "Moana." "I'm sorry," Edric whispered, his eyes wide as he took in my appearance. I didn't mean it. His face showed nothing but sincerity. I was hurt by what he had said, but I couldn't stay mad at him. Without a word, I held my arms out for him. Edric looked at me for a moment with shock on his face before he slowly walked toward me. He walked right into my arms, and his scent overwhelmed me. That sweet, tantalizing scent that made a shiver run down my spine. Outside, the sky had darkened and it had begun to rain. The sound of the rain hitting my windows filled the silence around us, and the darkness made me want to feel more of Edric's warmth. I looked up at him then. He was watching me intently as he held me, his steely gray eyes searching my face with sincerity and pure emotion. In the dark light of the thunderstorm outside, I thought that he looked so handsome. His gray eyes were ever so slightly glowing that same silver color as before, and I felt a slight smile spread across my lips as I noticed that tiny detail. Edric opened his mouth to say something, but I couldn't hold back any longer. I wanted him too badly. It had been too long, and now, as his scent filled my nostrils, I felt too compelled to be with him again. Before he could get any words out, I suddenly reached up and grabbed his face, pulling him down to my level. I pressed my lips against his with fervor and felt my body become overwhelmed with sensation, with desire. As I kissed him deeply, Edric let out a surprised moan. He pulled back slightly, only to give me an intense look of passion, before he firmly pushed me down against the bed and pressed his warm body against mine so that I could feel him entirely, which only filled me with even more desire. Suddenly, Edric scooped his arm under my back and pulled me up further onto the bed. By the time it was all over, I had almost forgotten entirely about why I was upset with Edric. I only felt overcome with peace and happiness, and my body felt as light as a feather. It felt as though a great, huge weight had been lifted off of me, and as I laid on Edric's chest and traced my finger along his skin and felt the bumps of his tight muscles beneath my fingertip, I couldn't help but smile. Neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. It felt good just to lay in quiet together, listening to the rain and each other's breathing. Edric lay beneath me, with his eyes closed and his hand running through my hair. His breathing was deep and steady, as though he was on the verge of sleep. With the pouring rain outside, I felt as though I could have fallen asleep too. I very much wouldn't have minded falling asleep there to the sound of the rain and the images of our shared passion flickering repeatedly through my mind. We did fall asleep for a little while. I laid on his chest and let myself doze off in the safety of his arms as I listened to the sound of his steady heartbeat filling my ears. But we weren't asleep for long, however, as we were both eventually awoken by the sound of frantic knocking on the door. We woke up still tangled in each other's arms, and as the frantic knocking continued, Edric quickly jumped up and put his pants on. I jumped up as well and hurriedly threw my dress on over my head, thinking that Ella or one of the maids might walk in at any moment and catch us in our post-passion embarrassment. When Edric opened the door, Selena was standing there. "What is it?" he asked, sounding slightly worried by the look in Selena's eyes. Selena looked back and forth between us for a few moments, clearly trying not to notice the fact that Edric was shirtless and my hair was a mess, before her cheeks went slightly red and she finally spoke. "The police are downstairs," the old housekeeper said, sounding both confused and concerned, and a little sheepish, as she surely knew what she had just walked into. "They want to speak to you." "Moana, the police are downstairs," the old housekeeper said, sounding both confused and concerned, and a little sheepish, as she surely knew what she had just walked into. "They want to speak to you." Edric and I suddenly looked at each other in shock. "I'll go," he said, grabbing his shirt off of the floor and putting it on. "You can stay here, Moana." But Selena shook her head and pointed at me. "They want to talk to her. They asked specifically for Moana." As Selena spoke, my eyes suddenly widened. Surely the police wanted to talk to me about Ethan and Kelly, but why now? They really came in the pouring rain? Couldn't they have called first? Edric, who seemed to be thinking the same thing, narrowed his eyes. "Well, it's not a good time," he said. "Why didn't they call first, instead of just showing up?" The old housekeeper shrugged. "I don't know, but they asked specifically for Moana." Edric looked at me again and opened his mouth to speak, but I shook my head and grabbed my sweater off of the chair. "It's fine," I said. "I'll go." The police were waiting for us in the lobby downstairs, as our new bodyguards were given strict orders not to let anyone in who wasn't one of us. Edric and I quickly put on our shoes and took the elevator down, and when we came out, I saw 2 officers sitting on the bench in the lobby waiting for us. They both stood when we entered. "What's all this about?" Edric asked, peering past them to look outside. Thankfully, because of the pouring rain, it seemed as though the paparazzi weren't lingering around outside like a bunch of hyenas. If pictures went around of 2 police officers coming into the building so soon after what happened at the warehouse, it was certain that there would be more media harassment about it. "Good afternoon," one of the officers said, who I recognized as the one that gave us a ride home after the incident at the warehouse. "I apologize for the intrusion, but we wanted to come and talk to you personally." "What do you need to talk about?" Edric asked. I could tell that he was feeling nervous, and so was I. I couldn't help but wonder if something had happened to Ethan or Kelly in jail, or something of the sort. "Well, we have some questions for Miss Fowler," the officer said, looking at me. "If you'd like to come down to the station with us, we'd like to perform an interview. We'd like your side of the story as to what happened leading up to the events at the warehouse a couple of weeks ago, and we need to take a formal statement." Edric suddenly frowned and protectively put his arm around my shoulders. "This is very sudden," he said. "I don't want to make my fiancé dredge up what happened that night without any time to prepare. If you call back another time, maybe we can set up a date." "I'm afraid it needs to be done today," the officer interrupted grimly. "This whole incident is causing a lot of media attention, and Ethan said, on the record, that Miss Fowler went to the warehouse willingly." My eyes widened. "I did not," I said, feeling my anger begin to bubble up inside of me. "He's a liar. That's not what." "Whatever you want to say will need to be saved for the interview," the officer said gently with a polite smile. "So you mean to interrogate my fiancé over something that my mentally insane, illegitimate half-brother said? You know he's full of shit, right?" Edric asked, sounding agitated now. The officer sighed and put his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "It's not an interrogation, Mr. Morgan," he said. "It's just an interview. We know that Ethan is not telling the truth, but we'd like to get Miss Fowler's statement first." He turned then to look back at me. "Now, if you'd like a ride down to the station, we could get this all over with today. Eventually, you may need to testify in court." I was still shocked by it all. Of course, Ethan was lying, but If the truth came out that I was trapped that night because I was trying to leave with Ella, would he and Kelly and Olivia get away with what I did? What if I got in trouble instead for attempted kidnapping since I took Ella without permission? No, I thought to myself. That was a ridiculous thought. I was clearly manipulated into going, and even if it wasn't clear enough, it didn't really matter. Either way, Ethan still tried to kill a pregnant woman and a little girl. But what really scared me the most was the thought of having to be interviewed on what had happened that night. I had seen clips of interrogations online where distressed victims were made to cry or have mental breakdowns over bringing up everything that happened, and I didn't want to be one of those people. Right now, the last thing I needed was to have a flashback and wake up in the hospital. Suddenly, Edric pulled me aside and spoke quietly. "You don't need to go if you don't want to," he said. "And if you want a lawyer because of what happened that night, I can get you the best lawyer in town." I shook my head. "No," I said. "It's okay. I'll go. It's better to just get this over with now, and there's no reason for me to get a lawyer. Unless the situation with Ella." "Don't worry about that," Edric reassured me. "This is all Ethan's fault. You don't have anything to worry about." I nodded reluctantly, then took a deep breath and turned back to face the two waiting police officers. "I'll go with you," I said, pulling my sweater more tightly around my shoulders. "But I want Edric to come with me, otherwise I won't go." I nodded my head toward Edric and stood up straight, holding my chin high. The officer who was speaking before nodded understandingly, then smiled politely again. "Of course," he said. "If you'd like to just grab your things, we can take you both." Edric and I quickly went back upstairs to grab a few things before heading out. Neither of us knew how long exactly this interview would take, so we told Selena to just give Ella dinner and that we would handle it ourselves later. Selena seemed worried about me, but I was intent on going. So long as I didn't have any flashbacks about that night, I was certain that I would be fine. I just needed to answer their questions truthfully. They already said themselves that they knew that Ethan was bending the truth. On the way there, however, as the rain battered against the window of the cop car, I felt my anxieties beginning to rise again. I kept seeing intermittent flashes of the gun in Ethan's hand, and it made me begin to wonder if the flashbacks would become too much during the interview. "You can do this," my wolf said, offering me some words of comfort on the drive. "If you get through this interview, it will ensure that Ethan and Kelly can never do something like this ever again." I swallowed as I looked out the window, feeling comforted by Edric's arm around my shoulders. "I hope you're right," I responded. "I really hope that you're right." Moana. When we arrived at the police station, Edric helped me out of the cop car and held me closely as we walked inside. Once we were inside, I immediately noticed that the other people who were there suddenly got very quiet and started giving Edric and I strange looks. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard to do that when I had spent the last 2 days at work being whispered about. Only this time, I didn't know whether they were whispering about my unluckiness as a late bloomer, or whether they were whispering about the warehouse incident. Either way, I felt myself getting somewhat sick as the officer led us down a narrow and fluorescent-lit hallway to the interrogation room. We stopped outside the door and he opened it, letting me in. It was a small room with a metal table in the center, a couple of chairs, and a fluorescent light on the ceiling. I could see a camera in the corner of the ceiling and a mirror, which I was certain was a one-way mirror. I instantly felt even more sick as I wondered just how many people were watching this. Suddenly, just as Edric was coming in after me, the officer stopped him. "Sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you to wait outside," he said. He sounded amicable, but his words made me nervous, and I could tell that Edric was just as nervous. "You promised that I could be with her," Edric said somewhat angrily. "Why can't I be with her now?" "I said that you could come to the station with her," the officer clarified. "But the interview needs to be completed with just her. She'll be fine. This will only take a short while." Edric looked at me with concern in his eyes. I felt terrified, but I hid it well and nodded at him, even going so far as to shoot him a reassuring smile before the officer closed the door. "Take a seat," the officer said, gesturing to one of the chairs. I sat down sheepishly, holding my purse in my lap as he sat across from me and pulled out a notebook. Now, let's begin. Can you tell me in your own words what happened that night before the police arrived at the scene of the crime? Yes, I replied. Slowly, I began to recount my experience that night. I started with the taxi ride, followed by discovering that Kelly was actually driving the taxi. But then, just as I was about to tell the officer how I was hit in the head and woke up in the warehouse, he stopped me. "Hold on," he said, holding his hand out as he furrowed his brow. "You said that you took a taxi at midnight," I said. "Why were you taking your daughter in a taxi headed away from Mr. Morgan's penthouse at midnight?" As the officer asked this question, I swallowed. I didn't know where to begin. If I revealed everything about Olivia, then it would potentially mean that the fact that I wasn't Ella's biological mother would be revealed to the public, which could cause a lot of problems. Not only that, but it could potentially get me in trouble for an attempted kidnapping. Of course, I knew that Edric wouldn't press charges, but once again, that sort of information being given to the public could be disastrous. I stammered, my heart racing. I felt myself get even more sick. "We'll come back to that," the officer said. "I'm sorry for interrupting your story. You can continue now." Swallowing again, I started to tell the rest of the story. I told the officer about how I was hit in the head and how Ella tried to run away. I then told him about waking up in the warehouse, tied to a chair with Ella beside me, a bright white spotlight in my eyes, and Suddenly, I felt even more sick. I tried to say the word that I couldn't seem to get out. "Gun." "Are you all right, Miss Fowler?" the officer asked. "Keep telling your story." "I am sorry," I said quietly. "He was holding a G-gun." As I spoke, I felt my vision begin to fade. The image of Ethan's twisted grin while he held the gun up to my head flashed through my mind. I felt myself slipping away from reality, being transported back to that horrible night. I saw Ella's sleeping little body tied up to that metal chair. I saw Edric's head split open, blood pooling up on the floor around him. I saw Kelly turning around in the driver's seat, sneering at me as she went on a tirade about killing us. I felt Ella burying herself in my side, and I heard her little terrified sobs. "Ma'am," the officer said, "I need you to cooperate, otherwise this is going to take a long time." "Right," I said, snapping back to reality for a few brief moments while beads of sweat began to form at the nape of my neck. As I was saying, he was holding a gun to my head, and there was a bright light. He told me that he was going to kill me and Ella because he wanted Edric to suffer. Once again, my voice faltered. My throat felt dry and cracked, and I reached for the glass of water sitting in front of me. I drank several gulps, but it didn't help. "Suffer for what?" the officer urged. "Did Edric do anything to Ethan at any point?" I shook my head. "No, that's the thing," I replied. "Edric didn't do anything. Ethan's mother killed herself. Well, Michael probably did it in all reality." The officer furrowed his brow and wrote furiously on his notepad. "Michael who?" he asked. I felt my eyes widen. I had said too much. "Michael Morgan," I replied. "Hold on." The officer set his pen down and folded his arms across his chest. "That's a very serious accusation, Miss Fowler," he said. "Are you accusing Michael Morgan of murdering Ethan's mother?" This was too much. I suddenly shook my head, feeling shame for bringing it up. I had said too much, and for all I knew, Michael was connected to people in the police department. Ethan had said that his mother's murder was covered up. What if the cops helped? What if they would tell Michael that I was trying to rat him out? As all of this whirled around in my head, I felt myself getting more and more dizzy. Suddenly, I felt as though I would throw up. I stood, clamping my hand over my mouth as vomit began to bubble up. The officer jumped up as well. He was saying something with a worried look on his face and was holding his hands out to me. But I couldn't hear what he was saying over the ringing in my ears. I don't feel so well," I murmured. I saw a flash of Ethan's face. "Ethan was the cop?" "No, I was just seeing things." I looked up at the mirror then and jumped when I saw Ethan standing behind me, holding the gun to my head. I whirled around, but he wasn't there. I started hyperventilating. "Miss Fowler? Miss Fowler!" the officer said. My knees buckled under me, and everything went dark. "Edric." I watched the police officer take Moana into the interrogation room and shut the door in my face before I could even really protest. "She'll be fine," I whispered to myself. But did I really believe that? What happened to Moana and Ella was extremely traumatic. At least Ella didn't have to remember what happened at her young age, but Moana, she would never forget it. I had already seen the way that it was affecting her since it happened. During normal conversations, she would go elsewhere. Whenever the events in the warehouse were brought up, her face would darken, and her eyes would gloss over, like she was reliving it. I tried to help snap her out of it whenever I noticed it happening, but I was worried that she would freak out in there, and I wouldn't be around to help her. I highly doubted that the police officer would know what to do, or if he would even care. To them, Moana was just a piece of evidence to collect before Ethan could be convicted. That was it. For a long time, I just paced back and forth outside of the interrogation room in that little hallway. There was no window on the door, and no matter how many times I asked, they wouldn't let me into the room next door with them to watch through the one-way mirror. I felt completely cut off from Moana, and it made me sick. Suddenly, one of the female officers came up to me as I was still pacing in front of the door. "Mr. Morgan," she said in a light, friendly voice with a plastic smile spread across her lips, "your fiancé will be fine. Why don't you come with me and I'll get you some coffee?" "No thanks," I replied. "I'll be staying right here." The female officer's face darkened slightly, but her smile didn't fade. "I'm afraid you can't stay here," she said. "We don't allow people to pace outside of the interrogation rooms, and it's a narrow hallway. Come with me. We have a nice room where you can wait and relax." I opened my mouth to protest, but before I could, the female officer took me by the arm and led me away. She led me down the hallway and into a small waiting room with a couple of vending machines, a few tables and chairs, and a coffee station. It was anything but comfortable in there, but I knew that it would be useless to try to get back to Moana, so I sat down at one of the chairs and put my head in my hands while I waited. A few minutes later, the female officer slid a cardboard cup of steaming coffee to me from across the table. "Here," she said. "It's good coffee. Cream and sugar?" I shook my head. "Black is fine, thanks," I muttered. I took a sip of coffee and it burned my tongue, but I didn't care. At least the motion of raising the cup to my lips and sipping the bitter coffee was something to keep my hands busy. After a few minutes, however, the still air in the waiting room and the hum of the vending machines only raised my anxieties, but it wasn't just that. Suddenly, I felt a pang in my chest. My wolf suddenly appeared, and he seemed panicked. Something was wrong. I suddenly stood so abruptly that I knocked my chair backwards onto the floor and toppled my coffee cup over, sending coffee spilling across the white lacquered table. I didn't care about that, though. While the female officer still stood there, in shock, I took off out of the room and bolted back down the narrow hallway toward where they were keeping Moana. "Sir," the female officer shouted, running after me. Her calls alerted other officers, who came out of adjoining rooms with puzzled looks on their faces. I ran past them, ignoring their demands for me to stop, but was suddenly halted by two officers who stepped into my way. "Sir, please calm down," one of the officers said, putting his hands up. "Come on, let's get you back to the waiting." "Get out of my way," I growled angrily. "My mate is in distress. I can feel it." The officers looked at each other, then back at me. I suddenly shoved past them to get closer to Moana, with only the thought of making sure that she was okay on my mind. I didn't care that they were yelling at me or threatening arrest for my actions. I just needed to get to Moana. However, I was quickly stopped by those same two officers tackling me to the ground. I felt my skin scrape against the tiled floor as I went down, but I only growled and writhed beneath the two officers. "Let me go," I snarled. "Just let me get to my mate." "Mr. Morgan, you really need to calm down," the female officer from before said. "Miss Fowler is fine. The interview will be done any minute now. Please just come back to the waiting room and relax, and we won't need to arrest you." The two male officers hauled me to my feet, each one of them holding me by each arm. Realistically, I could have used my strength and abilities as an alpha to break free and smash through the door to the interrogation room, but I knew that it was a futile effort that would only end in my arrest. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was seriously wrong, though. The aching pain in my chest was too distinct. It was the same pain that I felt when I realized that Moana and Ella were gone on the night that they were kidnapped. Only now that Moana and I had marked each other, it was even stronger and more visceral. Maybe the police officer was grilling her too hard in the interrogation room. Maybe she had a flashback. Or maybe something was wrong with the baby. "Look," I said, feeling desperate now. "I don't want to cause any trouble, but please just check on her. I have a really bad feeling." The three officers looked at each other. Finally, the female officer sighed and nodded. "I'll go and check," she said. "Just stay calm, okay?" "I will." I watched as the female officer walked away. Down the hall, I could see her knock on the door and crack it open a moment later. She poked her head in and said something. But then she opened the door further and gasped. I watched in horror as she ran in. Raised voices could be heard coming from the interrogation room, and that was when I'd had enough. I wrenched myself away from the two officers and bolted down the hall to the interrogation room, where I burst in through the open door. Just my eyes widened as I saw what was in front of me. Moana was passed out on the floor with her eyes rolled back, in some sort of fugue state. The two officers were bent over her. "What happened?" the female officer said. "I don't know," the other officer replied. "She just started to panic, and then this happened." I felt my heart sink. Growling, I shoved the officers and picked my maid up off of the floor. "Call an ambulance," I ordered, glaring at them with glowing eyes. "Moana." One moment, I was in the interrogation room with the police officer sitting across from me. "Miss Fowler?" he asked, standing from his seat with a worried look on his face. "Are you all right?" My eyes were wide and my hands were shaking. I was standing with my back against the wall, feeling as though I couldn't get a full breath into my lungs. The room felt as though it was closing in on me, and I felt trapped inside like an animal caught in a net. And then, suddenly, I felt my knees buckle under me. I fell to the ground, and then everything went dark, with only Edric being the very last thing on my mind. When I woke up, I was in a dark room. In fact, it was pitch black. But when I held my hands up in front of my face, I found that I could see my own hands perfectly. The room itself was black, like a void. "Hello," I called out. My voice felt thick and heavy. There was no echo and no response. I called out again. This time, after a few minutes of waiting, there was finally an answer. "Hello," a familiar female voice said. I immediately recognized it as my wolf, Mina. "Mina?" I called out. "What's happening?" But she didn't answer. In fact, a long time went by during which I didn't hear or see anything. It felt like an eternity, but also a split second at the same time. Was I sleeping? Was this just a strange dream? It felt too long and vivid to just be a regular dream. I felt perfectly conscious, not at all like I was in a dreamlike state. I had to rack my brain to remember what had happened at first, but finally it started to come back to me. I remembered being in the interrogation room. I was answering the police officer's questions, but it started to get to be too much, and I started having flashbacks when he started asking about the specifics of what happened in the warehouse. No matter how hard I tried to stay focused and keep myself level-headed, I couldn't stop seeing Ethan's gun in front of my face. At one point, I started to hyperventilate. Yes, that had to be it. I hyperventilated and lost consciousness. Surely, any minute now I would wake up and would be safely in Edric's arms once again. I never should have agreed to go down to the police station on a whim like that. I should have waited until I was mentally prepared. But it was okay now. I would be okay once I woke up. But I didn't wake up. A long time passed, and I stayed in the black void. I moved around, or at least I felt like I was moving around, but nothing changed. There was nowhere to go, and nothing to do except wait. Eventually, I started to wonder if I was dead. If this was what it was like to be dead, I thought to myself, then it was awful and lonely. The thought of being conscious with nothing but a void around me for all eternity made me shudder. At one point, though, I suddenly felt someone else's presence. A sort of presence, at least. I couldn't tell if I just made it up in my mind or if it was real, and if someone else was here with me. But when I started to see Michael's face materializing in front of me, I wished that it was neither of those things. I would have rather been alone. Go away, I told Michael, taking a few steps back. But he didn't speak. He just sneered at me, and eventually the rest of his body came into view, as though he was loading into this new instance like a virtual reality. His neck, then his shoulders, his arms and his chest, then eventually his hands. He was holding something in one of them, a knife. It wasn't just any knife, though. It was golden. Even the blade itself was golden, with an ornate handle that had the head of a wolf on the end. He was holding it tightly in his hand, unmoving. Then, suddenly, the void shifted. It changed from a black void to a rainy cliff with trees on either side. I felt a gasp catch in my throat, and I whirled around to see a sheer drop below me with nothing but blackness below. I should have killed you sooner, Michael's condescending voice said. I whipped back around to see that he was closer now. The knife was raised, ready to stab me. When I turned around, the tip of the knife was nothing more than a mere centimeter from my face, and I shrieked, stumbling backwards. I thought for sure that I would fall into the void now. But I didn't. I fell to the ground, and Michael stood over me, laughing. He walked closer, straddling me, and lowered himself. Then, holding the knife with both hands now, he raised it high. I screamed again, but it was no use. No one could hear me. No sound even came out of my mouth, just air. A bolt of lightning flashed overhead, illuminating Michael's evil, twisted face and his glowing eyes. He brought the knife down hard just as thunder rolled in the sky. He brought the knife back up, then down. Up and down, until there was nothing left of my chest except for a bloody crater. He laughed the entire time, and when he was finished, he stood and tossed the knife to the ground. He wiped his bloody face with the back of his hand. I was stiff now. I was dead, but I was conscious, and I couldn't move or scream or even blink against the rain that was beating down on my pale face. With another chuckle, Michael kicked me over the edge of the cliff, and I fell limply into the void like a rag doll. All around me, all I could hear was the sound of a baby crying. Suddenly, I awoke with a start, coated in a cold sweat. I woke up for real this time. Not in a void, but in a hospital bed, in a dark room lit only by the dim blue glow of the hospital machines. My body felt sore and weak, but it wasn't stiff, and when I looked down at my chest, all of it was still there. It was no longer a crater created by the knife that Michael wielded. Thankfully, it really was just a dream. I was asleep the whole time. But why was I in the hospital? Was my panic attack so bad that they had to take me to the hospital? But part of me didn't think that it was just a dream. I didn't know if I believed it or not, but the dream felt too vivid and too bizarre to just be a machination of my own anxiety. There was something prophetic about it. That knife, I had seen it 1,000 times before, throughout 1,000 lives. Each time, it had killed me, the golden wolf. And now, in this lifetime, someone had it. And that person was Michael. If he didn't have it already, then he would have it soon. And he would kill me with it. Edric. When I finally burst into the interrogation room, I found the 2 officers crouched over Moana as she was lying motionless on the ground with her eyes rolled back in her head. I shoved my way past them and scooped her up off of the floor, then ordered them to call an ambulance immediately, which they did. The ambulance came quickly, and before I knew it, I was sitting in the back of it and holding Moana's limp hand while they drove her to the hospital. She went into a state of temporary shock, the doctor said at the hospital, taking his stethoscope out of his ears and hanging it back around his neck with a sigh. I believe her wolf put her into a minor coma to cope with the stress in order to protect her and the baby, but there's no knowing exactly how long she'll be asleep. What do you mean? I asked. You don't know when she'll wake up? The doctor shook his head. No, I'm sorry. The best we can do is monitor her and try to get things like her blood pressure back down to a normal state and see if that does the trick. But unless her wolf decides that it's safe enough for her to wake up, she'll stay asleep. I'm sorry to say this, Mr. Morgan, but some wolves don't decide it's safe for a very long time, if ever. Just tell me what you're trying to say, I growled. Don't beat around the bush. The doctor swallowed and his face went pale. I'm saying that you should be prepared to potentially lose both Moana and your baby, he said quietly. As the doctor spoke, I felt anger bubbling up inside of me. I managed to stay silent and quelled that anger just long enough until the doctor left, but when he did, I lost it and punched the wall. Later, none of the nurses mentioned the hole that was left in the drywall by my fist, although I could see their eyes flickering nervously over to it whenever they came in. Moana stayed asleep for 3 days. During that time, I didn't leave her side. I didn't sleep or eat. I only sat and watched her intently, hoping and praying that she would wake up. I felt like such a jerk for letting her go down to the police station like that. I should have refused for her. I should have put my foot down and told both her and the 2 officers that no, she would not be going down there out of the blue to be interrogated. I should have gotten her a therapist the day after the incident in the warehouse, and I should have kept her home from work until she was in a better mental state. But I didn't do any of those things, and now I felt as though it was my fault that she was in the hospital like this. If I lost Moana and our baby, I didn't know what I would do. Maybe I would die along with them. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, my sleep deprivation was really getting to me. My speech was slurred, and I kept catching myself nodding off by Moana's bedside. I hadn't changed my clothes during that entire time, and I desperately needed a shower. Even the nurses took in my haggard appearance and seemed frightened of me. Finally, the doctor came in and told me that I needed to leave. "Go home and get some rest," he said gently, patting me on the shoulder. I stiffly looked up at him, still clutching Moana's small hand in mine. Even his form, which was right in front of me, seemed blurry and almost shapeless from my impaired vision due to lack of sleep. "Your driver is waiting outside for you, Mr. Morgan. Come on, I'll walk you out." I didn't want to go at first, but the doctor insisted. Finally, I agreed to go, although I felt my heart wrench as I let go of Moana's hand and walked away from her. But the doctor was right. I needed to sleep. I needed to shower and eat, and there was no doubt that Ella was absolutely distraught. I still needed to be there for my daughter, even if everything else was crumbling in around me. When I finally arrived back at the penthouse, it was just as I expected. Ella, Selena, and the maids were all beside themselves with grief and worry. They all looked just as haggard as I felt. Even Ella had dark circles under her eyes and a gaunt appearance to her face. "Is Moana coming home, Daddy?" Ella asked as I crouched down to her level in the foyer and pulled her in for a tight hug. I sighed and took Ella by both shoulders. She deserved to know the truth. "Moana is very sick, Princess," I muttered. "I don't know if she'll come home. Only time will tell. But the doctors are working very hard to make sure that she can come home to us." As I spoke, Ella's big eyes filled up with tears. I held her while she cried, and eventually carried her off to my room to let her sleep with me that night. After I showered, I came out of the bathroom to find her fast asleep in my bed with her little yellow stuffed duck that she never let out of her sight. I only wished that I could sleep like that, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't. And I didn't have my sleeping pills either. I couldn't drink, because if I needed to be there for Moana, I wanted to be sober. All I could do was lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling as sleep seemed so far out of reach. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I finally gave up on trying to sleep. Taking care so as not to wake Ella, I quietly got out of bed and got dressed, then left Selena a note before I headed downstairs and ordered the driver to take me back to the hospital so I could be near my mate. I didn't care that the nurses and doctors on the night shift whispered about me, or if they made comments about how I wasn't helping the situation by being glued to Moana's side. I needed to be near her. And in a strange way, I felt as though she needed me there, too. Maybe the presence of her fated mate would help her snap out of it, I thought. I tried to be hopeful. But at the same time, a darker, more macabre part of me just wanted to be there, because if she died, I didn't want to be away from her while it happened. At the very least, I knew that I needed to be beside her during her last moments. It didn't matter if it happened that night or 1,000 nights from now. I just needed to be with her. And so, on the 3rd night, I returned to Moana and fell fast asleep with my head on her leg, listening to the steady beat of her heart monitor, Moana. When I woke up, I found myself in a dimly lit hospital room with Edric sleeping on my lap. I was no longer floating in a void, nor was Michael above me with a knife. Instead, I was safe and sound with my mate by my side. But nothing felt right. That dream was too vivid to just be a machination of my own anxiety. It felt like an omen. Was Michael coming for me with that knife? Or was it really all just a dream made up in my own mind? Suddenly, Edric must have sensed that I was awake because he jerked his head up and opened his eyes wide. "Moana," he whispered. He lurched forward suddenly, looking relieved, and kissed me deeply. I was comforted, but also taken aback at the same time, and when we pulled apart, I gave him a puzzled look. "What happened?" I asked quietly. My throat felt dry and cracked. Edric shook his head. "You've been asleep for 3 days," he responded, his own voice shaking. "But you're okay. You're okay now." I felt my eyes widen as Edric spoke. "Edric, I have to tell you something." But before I could get a word out to tell him about my prophetic dream, the room suddenly became rushed with nurses and doctors who began taking my vitals, checking on me, and asking me questions. The room filled with a flurry of activity, and by the time all of the tests were over and they had finished wheeling me around to various rooms to get x-rays and scans, I felt utterly exhausted and disoriented. When I finally was returned to my original room, where Edric was waiting nervously with dark circles under his eyes, the doctor came in to give me my results. "It looks like both you and the baby are perfectly healthy," the doctor said with a smile. "You can thank your wolf for putting you in a dormant state, and you're lucky that you came out of it as soon as you did." "What should she do now?" Edric asked. I noticed that he was holding my hand tightly, but I didn't mind one bit. "I would like you to stay on bed rest for the next week," the doctor said as he scribbled furiously on his clipboard. "I'm going to send in a prescription for you for some special vitamins and some medicine to help you sleep if you need it, and I'd like you to come back when the week is over for a follow-up appointment." "A week?" I asked. I couldn't stay in bed for a week. I had a job to do, and I had already taken enough time off because of the whole warehouse ordeal. "It'll be okay," Edric said gently, rubbing my shoulder with a worried yet relieved look in his gray eyes. "It's just a week." "And it's necessary," the doctor continued. He gave me a stern look as he ripped the page off of his clipboard and handed it to Edric. "You've been through a lot of stress for someone who is still relatively early on in her pregnancy. At this point, if you don't dial things back and stop biting off more than you can chew, you'll jeopardize both yourself and your baby. And I know that you won't want to do that." I nodded slowly and stared down at my hands in my lap. The doctor was right, of course. I didn't want to put my baby in harm's way. I would just need to get through the next week and hope that the headmistress wouldn't fire me for being out of work so much. And then, hopefully, it would be smooth sailing. The doctor cleared his throat then and let out a sigh. "Now, this next part isn't so much an order as it is a strong recommendation," he said, leaning on the end of my bed with his hands as he looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "But I sincerely think that you should find a therapist. I don't know exactly what happened a few weeks ago, although I've heard bits and pieces. And I don't know if that's the only thing that has happened to you, but it's a lot for one person to process. Combined with the pregnancy hormones, you're setting yourself up for some severe postpartum depression or even postpartum psychosis." My eyes went wide. I had heard stories about women going through postpartum depression, and those stories were bad enough. Postpartum psychosis, on the other hand, turned out to be fatal more often than not without proper treatment. The things I had heard were troubling to say the very least. "Rest assured, doctor," Edric suddenly said, standing. "I have a few therapists in mind already." He looked at me for a moment with pain in his eyes, but there was something else there too. Fear. Was he afraid that I would kill our baby? Did he view me as a dangerous person because of what I went through in the warehouse, or was I just being paranoid now? The doctor, seemingly satisfied now by Edric's promise, nodded and shot me a smile. "I'm going to have you stay the rest of the night to keep an eye on your vitals, but you can leave after that," he said, patting my ankle. "If you need anything, just call one of the nurses." Edric and I watched the doctor leave. Once we were alone again, Edric sighed and ran a hand through his disheveled hair before he turned back to face me and offered me a weak smile. "Are you afraid of me?" I suddenly whispered, unable to contain myself. Edric's eyes widened. "What?" he asked, rushing over to my side. No, of course not, Moana. I just want to make sure that you get the help you deserve. I nodded slowly and stared down at my lap. It was comforting to know that Edric was worried about me, but at the same time it was frightening. I felt like a crazy person, someone who needed to be watched and monitored in case I had a sudden episode. But maybe Edric and the doctor were right. Maybe some therapy would be helpful in the long run. Earlier you said that you needed to tell me something, Edric said gently. What was it? I was suddenly reminded of my horrible dream. At the time I thought that it was an omen, but now, after being awake for a few hours, it didn't feel so scary at all. It really was just a dream, and nothing more. And I didn't want to worry Edric any further by mentioning it, so I shook my head and smiled. It was nothing, I said quietly, just a dream. I hardly even remember it now. Oh. Edric furrowed his brow and sat down beside me. He seemed a bit disbelieving, but he didn't push it further, and for the rest of the morning we dozed off together while the nurses floated in and out of the room. Hopefully it really was just a dream that would soon fade out of my memory completely. Moana, just as the doctor promised, I was prescribed some medicine for the baby and for sleep, and then I was sent home later that day, once my blood work and vitals all came back within a normal range. The entire way home, Edric didn't let go of my hand. Every time I glanced over at him, it seemed as though he was looking at me, and that was comforting to me. The memory of our time spent together in my bed before I was taken to the police station stayed in my mind, which was a welcome distraction from everything else. It felt as though there was no longer a wall between us, and I hoped that everything would smooth itself out from there. When we arrived back at the penthouse, Ella came running as soon as the elevator doors opened and practically flew into my arms. Moana, she cried, sobbing into my chest. I thought you were never going to come home. It's okay, baby. I cooed as I stroked her hair and held her tightly and blinked back my own tears. I'm home now. I could only imagine the sort of distress that Ella was under the entire time I was at the hospital. After learning about what happened at the warehouse, I imagined that the poor little girl feared the worst. Although Edric planned to find me a therapist, I just hoped more than anything that Ella could get some counseling too. Hopefully, at the very least, I thought that this ordeal was the last bit of stress we would need to deal with as a little family. Although with my dream about Michael still lingering at the back of my mind, I wasn't so sure that that would be the case. As I held the crying Ella in my arms and Edric silently rubbed my back, I suddenly looked up to see Selena standing in the doorway with tears in her eyes. Her face looked puffy, like she had been crying nonstop for days. Even just seeing her like that made me want to cry. Without a word, she walked up to me and pulled me in for a tight hug. The feeling of the old housekeeper's arms around me was a much-needed comfort, like an embrace from a mother. When we finally pulled away, I couldn't help but smile. Let's get you to bed, Selena said, guiding me to my room before I could protest. I glanced over my shoulder at Edric one last time, who just watched me with a worried expression on his face before he was out of sight. Selena led me to my room and laid me down, although I wasn't all that tired. If you need anything, just let me know, she said, patting my hand gently with a weak smile. I'll be here for you all day. Knowing that the old housekeeper would take good care of me made me smile. I was just glad to be home in a safe environment. Maybe now I would feel better about everything and wouldn't have another flashback. That afternoon, Edric had to leave to go to work, since he had apparently spent all of his time at the hospital. I thought that he should stay home and rest along with me, but he insisted on leaving, and part of me felt as though he secretly felt like he needed to work in order to regain a sense of normalcy. I just hoped that his exhaustion wouldn't hit him too hard, and I gave the alpha billionaire stern orders to have the driver take him to and from work, which he thankfully obliged. Ella, the two maids, and Selena floated in and out of my room for a while to check on me or keep me company, but for the most part, I was left alone so that I could rest. I wasn't tired, though, so I spent my afternoon drawing in my sketchbook and reading while wistfully glancing out the window and wishing that I could be in my classroom instead. At the very least, I did have my wolf to keep me company, although she was exhausted from protecting me during those few days and was not a constant source of conversation. It must have been around 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon when I was drawing in my sketchbook. I was working on a nature sketch and listening to classical music, and everything felt fine. That was why whatever happened next came as so much of a surprise. One moment I was smiling to myself as I drew. I was comfortably propped up in bed with the promise of a cup of tea and a sandwich for lunch on its way from Selena. My window was wide open, allowing the cool autumn breeze and the sounds of the city to float in. Everything felt comfortable, warm, and safe. The next moment, however, everything changed. It didn't feel as though any time passed at all. It was as though I was just sitting there, then I blinked, and everything was different. I was no longer in my bed. I opened my eyes to find that I was standing in the middle of my room, although that wasn't the most alarming thing. What was most unsettling, and what made me clap my hand over my mouth in shock, was the fact that I had somehow scribbled dozens upon dozens of pictures that were now scattered all around my bedroom. The floor was covered in pieces of paper ripped from my sketchbook. The lines on the pages were dark and heavy, and I had pushed down so hard on some of them that I had bored holes straight through the paper. All of the images depicted the most vile, violent scenes that I could have possibly imagined. Blood, gore, death. It was like a battle had been fought in my bedroom, and the evidence was on paper. I gasped as I looked around, but that gasp turned into an outright sob when I padded across my room to find that a particular sketch of Edric and Ella at the theme park on the Ferris wheel had been completely scribbled over and destroyed. I fell to my knees and sobbed again as I picked up the paper with shaking hands. I nearly shrieked when I saw that what I had covered my original sketch with was a dark, heavy, scribbled image of the knife from my dream about Michael. What had happened? I didn't remember doing any of this. I just blinked. One moment I was in my bed and comfortable, and then the next moment I was here with this horrific mess all around me. I didn't have a flashback or anything of the sort, at least I didn't remember having one. Suddenly I heard the door creak. I jumped to my feet in an attempt to slam it shut so no one would see, but it was too late. Celian was already standing in the doorway with a tray of food in her hands. "We didn't have mayonnaise, so I hope you don't mind," she began, but her voice faltered as she saw the mess in my room. The old housekeeper froze, her eyes widening as she looked around. "Moana, what happened?" I didn't know what to say. All either of us could do was stand there, frozen to our spots, and stare at each other in complete and utter shock. "Moana, Moana, what happened?" Selena asked as she looked around at the mess in my room with wide eyes. Scattered all around us were countless violent graphic drawings that I somehow scribbled out in an unconscious state, even though I had absolutely no recollection of any of it. I didn't know how to respond because I didn't even know what happened. All I could do was stand there frozen and stare at Selena. Selena slowly came into my room and set the tray of food down. "Are you okay?" she whispered. I nodded. As I did, I already felt that all too familiar sensation of hot tears pricking at the backs of my eyes. "I don't know what happened," I finally managed to say. One moment I was just sitting in my bed and drawing in my sketchbook, and then it was like I blinked and my whole room was just covered in whatever this is. The old housekeeper looked around with a wide-eyed gaze for a moment. "I'm so sorry," I said quietly as I began to stoop to pick up all of the discarded papers. "I made a huge mess." However, Selena just shook her head and took the papers out of my hands. She set them down beside the food and then guided me over to my bed. "I'm calling the doctor," she said. "Stay here." Within half an hour, the doctor was standing by my bedside. Selena had already cleaned up all of the papers. She didn't say anything in particular about the contents of the violent and graphic images, but I could tell that she was deeply concerned by them. The doctor looked at a few after he took my vitals and sighed. "Your vitals are fine," he said gently as he flipped through the drawings. As he did, I felt my face go red from embarrassment. It did seem, at the very least, as though Selena hid away the drawings that were the most graphic to save my dignity, which I appreciated more than anything. When the doctor was finished looking at the drawings, he handed them back to Selena and then gave me a worried look. "I can only reiterate that you need to see a therapist," he said. He paused, then made a sound to himself under his breath and pulled out his notepad. I watched as he scribbled on the pad, then tore the piece of paper off and handed it to me. On it was a name and a phone number. "What's this?" I asked, looking up at him. "It's a therapist that I'd highly recommend," he replied. "He specializes in post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. His methods are a bit out there, so to speak, but he's very good. I'd highly recommend giving him a call." I furrowed my brow. "What sort of methods are you referring to?" I asked. "Hypnotherapy, mostly," the doctor replied. "Some people see it as more of a fringe science, but his clients have all had very good results from what I've heard. Give it a try. You never know." I nodded slowly as I held the paper firmly in my hand. Hypnotherapy. It wasn't exactly something that I had ever thought of trying, but I supposed that it wouldn't hurt any to give it a shot. The doctor left after that. I thought I overheard him speaking in hushed tones to Selena outside of my room in the hallway, but I couldn't make out what was being said, and I didn't have the physical or emotional energy to get up and try to eavesdrop. All I knew was that, 5 minutes later, the old housekeeper was coming back into my room with a glass of warm milk in one hand and 2 pills in the other. "Here," she said, handing me the milk and holding her hand out for me to take the 2 round pink pills. "What are those?" I asked as I pointed nervously at the pills. Selena shook her head. "It's just your sleeping medicine," she replied. "Some rest will do you some good right now, I think." I nodded and took the pills. Selena was right. Sleep was important right now. At the very least, if I was asleep, I couldn't have another episode. I didn't even want to imagine what it would be like if I had another episode, especially if it happened in front of Ella. I didn't want to scare her after everything. Once I finished taking the pills, Selena tucked me into my bed and headed back toward my door with a drawn and tired look on her face. But before she could leave, I suddenly sat up and called after her. "You're not going to tell Edric, are you?" I asked, feeling my heart start to race. If Edric found out about this, he was certain to take it very poorly. What if he never wanted me to go back to work? What if he was even more scared of me now? What if he got too worried and became sick himself? Selena slowly turned back around and gave me a stern look that told me everything I needed to know before she even opened her mouth. I had no say in this matter. No one could trust my mental state anymore, and therefore my opinions were invalid because of whatever sickness was taking over my brain. I felt helpless. "He needs to know," she said, her voice low and even. I felt my palms start to itch with anxiety as my eyes began to well up with tears again. "Please," I begged. "Please don't tell him. I don't want him to get worried." "That's enough, Moana." The old housekeeper's voice was suddenly sharp and rigid, much like how she used to speak when I first moved in. For a moment, her body straightened and became hard as she gripped the handle of the door. My eyes widened slightly at her stern appearance, but after a moment, she let out a deep breath and relaxed once more. "He deserves to know the truth," she said gently. "I'm sorry, but we can't keep this from him. It's for your own good." Before I could say anything else, the old housekeeper suddenly swung the door open and left. Sniffing, I sank back down into my bed and stared blankly up at the ceiling, as all of the worst possible outcomes floated through my mind. I imagined Edric coming home and hearing about my episode, seeing my horrible drawings, and immediately sending me off to a psychiatric facility. I imagined my baby being ripped away from me in a padded room because the doctors thought that I would be a danger to my own child. I imagined Ella growing up thinking that I was a scary person, someone who only made a year of her childhood a living hell because I was constantly causing trouble or putting her in danger. But then the medicine quickly began to kick in. Everything suddenly started to feel warm and fuzzy as the ceiling began swirling and drifting above me, and nothing felt quite so bad anymore. In fact, everything just felt distant and foggy, like nothing but a bad dream. Within minutes, I found myself floating off into a dreamless sleep without a care in the world. Edric. I hated to leave Moana behind, but I missed too much at work while she was in the hospital. Now that she was safely at home, I only needed to go to the office for a couple of hours to deal with some meetings. Unfortunately, those couple of hours quickly turned into a full day of work. By the time I headed home, it was already starting to get dark out. All I could think about was getting home to Moana and my daughter and spending the rest of the evening with them. However, when I got home, things seemed incredibly off. The penthouse was dark and quiet when I arrived. It wasn't that late, which was a bit confusing. But as I started to make my way through the penthouse and found Selena sitting in the kitchen by herself, with only a lamp illuminating the room, I quickly realized why everything felt so strange. Selena was sitting with her back turned to the kitchen door, but I could tell instantly from the way that her shoulders were shaking that she was crying silently. She stopped when she heard me coming, but I knew that she was crying. No matter how quickly she tried to wipe away her tears and smile, it was too obvious. "Hungry?" she asked, getting up and wiping her hands on her apron. "Sit down. I'll make you something." I slowly walked into the kitchen and sat down, watching as the old housekeeper scurried around and began preparing a meal. It was strange to see her acting so emotionally. She was normally such a stoic and stern person as long as I had known her. And yet, since she met Moana, that seemed to change. It seemed as though she was beginning to see Moana as something like her own daughter, and it was clear that the warehouse incident and the 3-day-long hospital stay were both getting to her. But I could tell that something else was wrong. "What's going on?" I asked suddenly, unable to contain my curiosity. Selena made a face as she clicked on the burner on the stove and spread butter on some bread to start making a grilled cheese. "What are you talking about?" she said. It was clear that she was hiding something, judging by the look on her face. "Tell me what it is, Selena," I said. "Is something wrong?" The old housekeeper paused, then sighed. She set the bread down in the pan, then put a few slices of cheese on top before wiping her hands on her apron once more. I watched as she nervously withdrew a folded piece of paper from the pocket on her apron with shaking hands. "Moana had another episode," she said, shakily handing me the paper. I took it with a furrowed brow and unfolded it. My eyes widened as I saw the contents of the page. It was a drawing made with dark, heavy strokes that depicted a strange knife with a slightly curved blade and a wolf's head on the handle. It looked oddly familiar to me, for some strange reason, but the pressure of the lines and the way that the drawing seemed so chaotic indicated that it was not drawn while Moana was in a normal mental state. What especially gave that away was the fact that it was drawn over the picture that Moana drew of Ella and I on the Ferris wheel. I knew that she would never want to draw over that picture. "She said she doesn't remember anything," Selena continued. "She said that she was just sitting in her bed, and then when she came to, she was surrounded by dozens of similar pictures. I found her like that, and I believe her, but I think she needs help, Edric. Serious help. Help that we might not be able to provide for her here." Suddenly, I looked up at the old housekeeper with my eyes narrowed. "What are you trying to say?" I growled. Selena, seemingly unfazed by my anger, sighed again. "I don't know. Maybe she should be in an institution for a while where they can keep a close eye on her and take better care of her than we can here." "You're suggesting that I send the mother of my child away to a psychiatric facility?" I said, standing suddenly as I gripped the paper tightly in my hand. "I won't do that. I won't send her to one of those places." Selena narrowed her eyes at me. "What do you suggest, then?" she murmured. She pressed her lips into a thin line and glared at me for a few long moments before she hastily turned around and flipped the sandwich over in the pan, causing it to sizzle. As she did, I looked back down at the drawing in my hand and studied it even more closely. There was indeed something familiar about it, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. All I knew was that I had seen it somewhere before, meaning that it wasn't just a violent image that Moana made up in her own head. At the very least, I wouldn't assume that right away. I had to give her the benefit of the doubt before I jumped to conclusions and sent her away, which would likely only make her symptoms even worse. No, I had to do some research on this knife before I did anything else. "Where is she now?" I asked. "She took some of her medicine and she's sleeping now," Selena replied. I called the doctor, and he came and checked on her. He says that her vitals are fine, but he left the name and number of a hypnotherapist who can supposedly help. But I don't believe in that sort of stuff. I think she needs a more straightforward approach. For a few moments, I stared at the back of the old housekeeper's head, at the perfectly round gray bun that rested just at the nape of her neck. She tersely shoved a spatula under the grilled cheese that she was cooking and moved the sandwich to a plate before clicking off the stove and turning back to face me. But by the time she did that, I was already gone. I ignored her calls and stormed into my office, where I shut and locked the door. My mate wasn't crazy. I had seen this knife before, and I was sure of it. I could sense it. It had to have some sort of significance. Yes, Moana's trauma in the warehouse was sure to cause her plenty of problems, and I was still going to get her some help, but this felt different. That night in the warehouse, she had marked me. I remembered when I finally healed and I stood up. Ethan picked her up by her throat and was choking her when a bright golden light burst out of her and blasted him backwards, throwing him to the ground. That night, it was very likely that her golden wolf abilities were beginning to surface, and maybe this drawing was a depiction of more of her abilities coming to light. It seemed to me that Moana may have begun having visions, and the depiction of this strange knife with the wolf head handle could be significant to her future. Moana. The medicine that Selena gave me must have made me sleep for a long time because it was bright outside when I finally woke up. When I rolled over to glance at my clock with my bleary eyes, I saw that it was 8 o'clock in the morning already, even though it felt as though I only slept for 5 minutes. Yawning, I rolled back onto my back and suddenly felt a comforting presence beside me. It was Edric. Moving slowly in order not to wake him, I slowly rolled over to face Edric and couldn't help but smile. He was sleeping soundly beside me. I hadn't been dragged off to a psychiatric facility in my sleep. At least, not yet. Slowly, his eyes cracked open and he turned to face me. His hand came up and stroked my hair for a moment before he pulled me in tightly and let me bury my face in his chest. We stayed like that for a long time, just holding each other. I breathed in his scent in big, deep breaths and felt myself relax a little more with each one. When we finally pulled away, I felt a little bit better. But the concerned look on Edric's face made my comfort turn into more worry. "Selena told you, didn't she?" I asked quietly, feeling my heart start to race as I started to fear the worst. Edric slowly nodded. Instantly, I felt tears begin to well up in my tired eyes. "Are you going to send me away to a mental institution?" Suddenly, Edric pulled me close again and shushed me. "Of course not," he whispered, stroking my back while I quietly cried into his chest. "I wouldn't do that unless there was absolutely no other choice, and even then it would take a lot to convince me to send you away like that. I'm always on your side, Moana." I slowly looked up at Edric, who looked down at me with nothing but love in his eyes. It was comforting to know that he wasn't going to send me away, but at the same time, I was still scared of myself. As the memories of my drawings slowly floated back into my groggy mind, I felt more and more guilty and afraid by the horrible images that I drew when I was unconscious. While many of the images were just violent nonsense, depicting things like blood and gore, the one picture that really stuck in my mind was the picture of the same knife from my dream about Michael. The one that had the slightly curved blade and the wolf head handle. There was something strange about that knife, like I had seen it 1,000 times before, even though at the same time I felt as though I hadn't seen it even once in my entire life. In a strange and unfamiliar way, it felt like some sort of omen. As I looked up at Edric, too, I could tell that he had seen the drawing of the knife. He seemed to have a puzzled expression on his face, as though he was also trying to rack his brain over it. "That knife," I said quietly, sitting up and rubbing my tired eyes. "Have you seen it before?" Edric slowly sat up beside me and leaned his back against the headboard of my bed. When I looked over at him, I saw that he was repeatedly running his hand through his dark hair and had a faraway expression on his somber face. "It does look sort of familiar," he said quietly, "but I don't want you to worry about it, all right? Maybe you just saw a picture of it somewhere and forgot." If you're really worried about it, I can look into it for you, but I just want you to relax and stop stressing about these things. Okay? I nodded slowly. Of course I trusted Edric, and he was right. Stressing over it wouldn't help any. Sighing, I reached over to my bedside table to get a drink of water, and as I did, my hand ran across the note that the doctor left for me with the therapist's name on it. I paused and picked it up, then handed it to Edric. The doctor gave me this. I know, Edric interrupted. Selena told me. Do you want to see that therapist? For a few moments, I just looked down at the note in my hand and pursed my lips, thinking. I had never heard much about hypnotherapy, but it sounded interesting. And if it could get to the bottom of these strange occurrences I was having, then maybe it would be helpful in more ways than one. Maybe this therapist could help me realize that the dream about Michael and the violent drawings were just created by my stress and didn't have any tangible meaning. Or maybe he could use hypnotherapy to help me understand whether there was actually a deeper meaning behind these things, and could potentially help me prepare just in case the dream and the drawings were some sort of omen. I'll give it a shot, I guess, I finally said, still holding the small piece of paper in my hand. If you think it might help. Edric nodded. I think it would be good for you to talk to someone with experience, he said. I won't force you to do it, but I do think that you should try. But I have to ask you something. Of course, I replied. What is it? For several long and silent moments, the alpha billionaire seemed to be at a loss for words before he finally licked his lips and spoke. When you were in your coma, did you see anything? As Edric asked me this question, my eyes widened. I didn't want to mention it to him. I thought that it was just a bad dream caused by stress, and that I would forget it. But I still remembered it so vividly, and it seemed as though this knife that I drew was completely connected to the dream. It couldn't just be a coincidence. Finally, I nodded and decided to tell Edric everything. I told him about my dream, about Michael and the knife. When I was finally finished, his steely gray eyes were wider than I had ever seen them before, and his face was as white as a sheet. It's probably nothing, I said. Like you said, maybe I just saw a picture of that knife somewhere and forgot, and combined with my stress about being the golden wolf. Edric suddenly shook his head and stood. He had a faraway expression on his face again, like he was thinking deeply. I couldn't tell if he suddenly had an idea, or if I offended him by mentioning such a violent and horrible dream about his father. I opened my mouth to ask him if I said something wrong, but before anything could come out, he suddenly turned on his heel and disappeared from my room. Once again, I was left alone and confused. Did Edric know something about this knife and the dream that I had about Michael, or was it something else? Moana. By the next morning, Edric had already called the therapist for me, and I was scheduled to have my first session right there in the penthouse that very morning. I was nervous, but also excited in a strange way. I wanted to get to the bottom of these strange occurrences, not only to figure out why this knife seemed to be so prominent in my mind, and to see if it had any real, tangible significance, but I also wanted to get better so I could return to work. When the therapist walked into my room, I immediately noticed that he seemed like a nice man. He was older, tall and thin, and had a completely bald head with a gray mustache on his upper lip and a pair of round wire-rimmed glasses sitting on his nose. He had a warm smile on his face and wore a tweed suit and carried a notebook in his thin hand. "Hello, Moana," he said, holding his hand out for me to shake. "I'm Dr. Rhodes. Are you ready to get started?" I nodded nervously. Edric had moved a small love seat into my room that was placed across from my armchair by the window, and I gestured for the therapist to sit on the armchair while I sat down on the love seat. It felt strange to have a therapist in my bedroom, but it was also comforting to be doing this in a comfortable space that I knew well. "So," Dr. Rhodes said as he opened up his spiral-bound notebook, "can you start with telling me what's been going on recently?" I took in a shaky breath, then began. "A few weeks ago, I was kidnapped and held at gunpoint." Over the course of the next half hour, I explained everything to Dr. Rhodes. I told him everything about the kidnapping, about Kelly and Ethan, about witnessing the fight between Ethan and Edric, and about Edric almost dying. I told him about Ethan choking me, the incident at the police station, and finally I told him about the dream that I had in the hospital. Of course, he asked a lot of questions about my relationship with Edric. Earlier, Edric had told me that it was okay to be completely truthful about our fake engagement with Dr. Rhodes, as it would be illegal for him to reveal the truth to anyone else. And so, by the end of the 30-minute mark, I had explained everything to Dr. Rhodes from beginning to end. When I was finished, the therapist leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment, processing what I told him while I nervously fiddled with my hands on the love seat. When he finally opened his eyes again, he smiled at me. "I think I'd like to hypnotize you," he said. "If you're comfortable with it. I nodded and took in a deep breath. Will it help me figure out what that dream was about and why I blacked out and drew those pictures?" Dr. Rhodes shrugged lightly. "There are no guarantees," he said. "Not everyone is susceptible to hypnosis. If you're not open to it subconsciously, it might not get you anywhere. There's also a possibility that the dream and the drawings don't actually mean anything more than a simple machination of stress in your mind after the traumatic events. Perhaps you subconsciously view Edric's father as the last remaining threat to your physical safety now that Ethan and Kelly are behind bars. Or maybe they're visions," I blurted out. The therapist looked at me blankly for a few moments before standing. "I won't say anything in regards to that just yet," he said. "I don't want to make assumptions before our session is done." I nodded uncomfortably. The therapist directed me to lie down on the love seat. He closed the curtains and dimmed the lights in my bedroom, then began the session. He started by playing a low, droning tone on a singing bowl in his hand for a long time while he repeated a mantra, then had me repeat the same mantra for a long time while he circled around me with the singing bowl, causing the low tone to emanate around me from all directions. With my eyes closed, it felt a little disorienting. After that, he began to ask me questions. But I didn't really feel any different. Even after almost half an hour of attempting to get me into a trance, I still felt perfectly conscious and found myself entirely incapable of delving deeper into my subconscious mind. After half an hour of trying to hypnotize me, Dr. Rhodes finally ended the session. He opened my curtains and helped me sit up, then sighed deeply. "I think that's all we'll be able to manage today," he said, sounding regretful. "I'm sorry, but I don't think that you're subconsciously prepared to go into a trance." Oh. I felt a little disheartened. "But don't worry," Dr. Rhodes said. "It doesn't mean that this session wasn't helpful at all. I'm glad that we had a chance to talk about everything that's getting to you, and it's helped me to better understand your mental state. Sometimes just talking about these sorts of things is enough to help the brain unwind. Do you feel any more relaxed than before?" I paused for a moment thinking, but finally nodded. "I do feel a little better," I said. Dr. Rhodes shot me a wide grin. "Good. I'll come back next week and we can have another session. Whether or not you want to just stick with talk therapy or try hypnosis again is completely up to you. Okay?" "Okay." I stood, then walked over to the door with Dr. Rhodes, but before I opened it, I suddenly turned to face him with a burning question on my mind. "Dr. Rhodes," I said, "can I go back to work, do you think? I really hate being cooped up." The therapist looked at me for a little bit. "Would it make you feel better?" he asked. I nodded vehemently. "Yes, I love working with my students. Without that, I feel like I'll go crazy." Dr. Rhodes nodded. "Well, that's up to you then," he said. "I think that if it would help you, then you could go back to work. But I think that you should make sure you have an aide in the classroom in case you have another episode. In fact, if you do go back to work, I must insist that you have an aide, actually." After that, Dr. Rhodes and I said our goodbyes, and I saw him out. As I watched him disappear into the elevator, I thought about what he said about an aide, and it reminded me of my conversation with Edric about having a bodyguard in the classroom. At the time, I hated the thought of having a bodyguard with me, but now, after everything, I was beginning to realize that the help was really important. And I couldn't stay cooped up in this penthouse all day. With Ella still going to school and Edric going to work, it was just me, Selena, and the maids all day, and they were busy during the day as well. I feared that if I stayed cooped up in the penthouse for much longer, my mental health wouldn't get any better. So I waited for Edric to return home from work that day so that I could talk to him about bringing a bodyguard to my classroom. My dear readers, thank you for stopping by and reading this story. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm trying my best to update Ask P. I'll appreciate it if you explore my other stories as well. Please follow my page Eve Above Story and Group Eve's Alphas if you want to chat or keep updated on my writing schedule. Yours, Eve Above Story. Edric. When I arrived back at the penthouse after work, I half expected Moana to be still laid up in bed and exhausted after her first therapy session. That would have been perfectly fine and reasonable, but I was completely not expecting her to be standing in the foyer when I first stepped out of the elevator. "I want to talk to you," she said without so much as a greeting. She grabbed my hand and began to tug almost aggressively on my arm, like I was being an inconvenience just for trying to set down my briefcase and hang my suit jacket on the hook. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," I blurted out with a chuckle as she tried to pull me away. "What's the big deal? I haven't even walked in the door yet. Is everything all right?" Moana nodded. There was a bit of a twinkle in her eyes, which made me smile a bit. That twinkle also made me involuntarily let my guard down, which allowed her to succeed in yanking me away to my office. She pushed me inside and closed the door behind us, which made me think that either one of two things were going to happen. Either she was going to start an argument with me, or she was going to leap on me in a passionate frenzy after being cooped up all day. Neither of those things happened, though. "I want to talk to you about something," she said, putting her hands on her hips. "It's important." I furrowed my brow, but nodded anyway as I took off my suit jacket and loosened my tie. "Go ahead," I said. "Lay it on me." Moana took a deep breath, then spoke very quickly and all in one breath, as though she expected me to shut her up right in the middle of her sentence. "I want to go back to work, and the therapist said that he thinks it could be good for me as long as I have an aide, and I was thinking that maybe we could talk about the bodyguard situation again and—" "Geez," I said, putting my hands up in surrender as I sank down into my chair behind my desk. "Talk slowly, one thing at a time." Moana sighed. "The therapist said that he thinks it might be good for me to return to work, so long as I have an aide with me in case anything goes wrong," she said. "I know that the doctor told me that I should take a week of bed rest, but I feel like I'm going crazy in here with you and Ella being gone all day. I really miss my job, so I was thinking that we could talk about the bodyguard situation again." I raised my eyebrows. There were only a few days left of Moana's week of bed rest, but she seemed so passionate about it that I had a hard time saying no. Even though it terrified me, I knew how happy teaching made her. And if the therapist said that it could be good for her, then maybe it wouldn't be so bad so long as she promised to keep the bodyguard by her side. Besides, I did have the perfect candidate lined up. I'm Catherine, but you can just call me Cat. The female bodyguard sent to me by my chief of security stood in front of Moana and me in my office the next morning. After some thought, the night before, I finally agreed to at least let the two of them meet to see how it would go. Catherine, Cat, was tall and slim, with short black hair cut into a boyish style, and stood in a powerful stance. However, unlike many of the other bodyguards who I had interviewed when I was first setting up our security team, Kat also seemed sweet and friendly. I could tell instantly just from the way that she interacted with Ella when she first came in earlier that day that she would be really good with kids, which was a relief. I could also tell that Moana liked her right off the bat, and so I sat back and allowed them to talk, while I only asked a few obligatory questions in regards to Kat's abilities. I could sense that Kat's wolf was strong, too. She seemed like the perfect fit, honestly, and by the end of our interview, I had a good feeling about it. Now all that was left was for Moana to approve of having Kat in her classroom. The night before, when I told her that I would let her go back to work early, it was only under one condition. She had to have her bodyguard with her at all times. Moana, unlike before, was just so desperate to go back to work that she was finally open to the idea, and I was feeling a lot better about it myself. Therefore, that evening, I already knew Moana's official answer before she gave it to me. I think I'd be okay with having Kat in my classroom, she said, holding her chin up high as she spoke to me. I'll have to make sure that she's good with the kids, though. I'm sure she will be. I cut my steak on my plate and popped a piece in my mouth, chewing slowly as I watched a whole host of emotions run across Moana's pretty face. I could tell how badly she needed to return to her normal life. Although I still hadn't gotten to the bottom of whatever that knife represented, I had hope, and unbeknownst to Moana, I had begun some research on what to do if she suddenly shifted. As it turned out, the Mother Witch had some apprentices who were very helpful the past few days, and when Moana thought I was at work, I was actually spending part of my day talking to them. Although I didn't tell them that Moana was the golden wolf out of fear of them turning on us, they did have some ideas for keeping her safe if she shifted. One of those ideas was a perfume that could mask her scent if she shifted, which they were still working on. I just hoped that it would work on the golden wolf's scent. I guess it's settled then, Moana said matter-of-factly. I'll notify the headmistress that I can return to work tomorrow. Even though I still felt as though it was a bit too early, the happy look on my mate's face made it all worth it. Besides, I thought, maybe Moana and Kat could eventually become friends while Kat was working as Moana's bodyguard. After all, Moana had just told me how the prejudiced people at the school weren't talking to her much since she was a late bloomer. I knew how badly she needed a good friend. Sometimes, in my opinion, having a good friend to lean on during bad times was more helpful than any kind of medicine. And I figured that having a good friend to talk to, along with the right therapy, might help Moana relieve some of her stress. The doctor did tell me, after all, that any more stress could be detrimental for both Moana and the baby. And that terrified me.